to the Anthropocene, the notion that human beings now are the most influential agents on Earth. I just wondered, just to kick us off, whether you could just give us a sense of your thesis of Homo Deus, and what it is you are trying to get across in this quite remarkable book.
Well, to try to make it very brief, I begin by stressing the amazing achievements of humankind in the last century and the unprecedented position that we find ourselves in today. For thousands of years, the three biggest problems of humankind have been famine, plague, and war. And humans have prayed to every conceivable god, an angel, and saint to help them, and it didn't work. And they tried all kinds of political systems and economic models, and this didn't work either. And then, over the last century or so, thanks largely to human ingenuity and to scientific development, we have managed to rein in, to gain control of famine, plague, and war. There are still, of course, huge problems in the world. There is still violence, there is still disease, but these have become from uncontrollable forces of nature into something that we know better and better how to prevent and overcome. Today in the world, more people die from eating too much than from eating too little. For the first time in history, I think the last data from the World Health Organization says that about 3 million people die each year from obesity and related diseases, compared to 1 million people that die from starvation and malnutrition. At the same time, for the first time in history, more people die from old age than from infectious diseases. And also, for the first time in history, more people commit suicide each year than the total number of deaths from war, crime, and terrorism put together, which is very good news.
Not the suicide bit, presumably.
No,
but
the fact that, yes. It's going down. It's not that suicides have went up. It's that death from violence have gone down. Today, let's say for the people here in this room, I think it's safe to say that McDonald's and Coca-Cola pose a far greater threat to your life than Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. The chance that you will die from eating too much at McDonald's is about 1,000 times higher, and this is not an exaggeration, this is statistics. It's about 1,000 times higher than the chance you'll be killed by some Islamic State terrorism attack. So we are gaining the ability to bring under our control these huge problems. Again, there are still problems, of course, but most of them, when it comes to famine, plague, and war, are the result of human politics and human incompetence, not of human ignorance. If you, again, take famine, there are no longer any natural famines in the world, only political famines. If a human being today on Earth dies because they don't have enough to eat, in Syria or in North Korea or in Somalia, it's not because of natural causes. It's because some political leader or government or ideology wants them to starve to death. So this is a new phase in the history of the world. We have managed, without any divine help, to bring these three problems under our control. And then the next question that the book Homo Deus asks is, what next? So if we have solved, or we are in the process of solving these problems, what will we do with ourselves in the next century or two? And the book suggests that the next big projects of humankind will be to overcome old age and death, to find the keys, the secret to happiness, and to basically upgrade humans into gods. This is why the title Homo Deus, God-Man. And I don't mean it as a kind of literary metaphor. I mean it in the literal sense that for thousands of years, humans have imagined gods in a particular way. They ascribed particular abilities and qualities to gods. And we are here in a church, and the walls are full of these descriptions of what God can do. And we are now seriously in the business of acquiring these traditional divine abilities and qualities to ourselves, whether it's trying to overcome death and gain immortality, or whether it's gaining the ability to create and design life according to our wishes. In the Bible, in the book of Genesis, basically the first thing God does is to create animals and plants and humans according to his wishes. We are now trying to gain this divine ability to ourselves. It's very likely that in the 21st century, the main product, the most important products of the human economy will no longer be just vehicles and textiles and food and weapons. The main products will be bodies and brains and minds. And in a way, we are even reaching beyond what ancient religions ascribed to the gods. Because the gods, like Jehovah in the Bible, they could create only organic beings. If you're a creationist, and you look at the world, so all these animals, all these plants, God created them, and they're all organic. Now humans are trying to do better than that. We will not just gain the ability to create these organic beings that's been around for 4 billion years. We are in the process of learning how to create the first inorganic entities, inorganic beings, like artificial intelligence, that ever existed. So in this sense, it's a literal claim that humans are trying to upgrade themselves into gods. Now, in order to do that, we'll have to turn our gaze from the world outside to the world inside. The huge achievements of humankind in the past, especially the overcoming of war and famine, have been the result of humans gaining mastery over the world outside, over the environment. The next phase will involve trying to gain mastery over the world inside, of deciphering the human biochemistry, our bodies, our brains, learning how to re-engineer them, learning how to manufacture them. This will require cooperation between the life sciences on the one hand and computer sciences on the other hand, because this already requires not just breakthroughs in our understanding of biology. This will require a lot of computing power. There is no way that the human brain has the capacity by itself to decipher the secrets, to process the data that is necessary to understand what's happening inside. You need help from artificial intelligence. You need help from big data systems. And this is what is happening already today, that we see this merger of the biological sciences with computer science. The result, however, may not be the upgrading of humans into gods. The result may be the end of humanity, because humanity will create something far more powerful than itself. Once you have an artificial intelligence or a big data system that understands you better than you understand yourself, then you're useless. You're irrelevant. Anything you can do, this system can do better. And it's a distinct possibility, it's not a prophecy, but it's a distinct possibility that in the 21st century, most humans will therefore find themselves in a new category, in a new class of humanity. Just as in the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution created a new massive class of the urban working class, the proletariat. And much of the political and social history of the 19th and 20th century revolved around this new working class. So the 21st century will create a new massive class of useless people. the useless class. And maybe much of the social and political history of the 21st century will revolve around the problems and the hopes and the fears of this new massive useless class. So these are just some of a short outline of some of the main ideas of
I might
the
go
book.
back to predicting inflation in 3 months shortly, but okay, there's such a huge amount of ideas there, but I just wanted to kind of just rewind slightly before we go into all these issues about this new class of human being, or however we might describe it. Yuval, when you set out on Sapiens, your historic look at how Homo sapiens have developed through their history, was it always seen to you as a sort of two-book project, so to speak? And how much is Homo Deus built on the trends that you defined in Sapiens? Because in Sapiens, you portray a world where Homo sapiens put themselves in a position of dominance. And at least part of your argument for Homo Deus appears to be that this new supercategory of human being, Homo Deus, will put itself in a dominant position given how Homo sapiens have behaved in the past. And you make some links, for example, in the way that Homo sapiens deal with animal husbandry, or don't deal with animal husbandry, to be frank. What are the lessons from Sapiens that you drew out and built into the Homo Deus work?
Well, first of all, when I started Sapiens, I had no idea I will even have one book, let alone two. Homo Deus is a direct continuation of Sapiens, but it really kind of wrote itself because I was giving all these interviews and all these talks, and I'm an historian, I really like the past, but the vast majority of the questions were about the future. Like people say, okay, the past, but what will happen now that you told us about these 70,000 years, what will happen next? So these were most of the questions and most of the requests for interviews and talks wanted me to speculate about the future. So from interview to interview and article to article, Homo Deus started to take shape. And it is definitely built on the foundations, on the ideas of Sapiens. In particular, Sapiens, the book, the main thesis there is that what enabled human beings to conquer the planet and to turn themselves from insignificant apes into the masters of the planet is their ability to cooperate in large numbers, which in turn is founded on their ability to create fictions and spread them around and believe in them. At the basis of all large-scale human cooperation, you always find some fictional story, whether it's about God or about the nation or about human rights or about money. There is always fiction at the basis. And what I'm trying to do in Homo Deus is see what happens when these mythologies, these fictions, meet godlike technologies that for the first time make it possible to start realizing the myth, not after you die in some fantastic heaven, but here on Earth with the help of technology. I'm a historian. My background in the humanities. I'm a terrible technophobe. I hardly know how to turn on the television. I have to rely on my husband to do that. And so I'm not really interested in the technical aspects of big data or artificial intelligence. I just take it for granted. Okay, artificial intelligence will soon be able to drive a car by itself.
Don't you need to be? Don't you need to be? Some people in the AI market or in AI research would maybe argue that the problem with interlopers coming in who don't know about the technology and not quite sure how to turn the TV on is that how can they make sensible predictions about what AI may or may not do for human beings and to human beings, I think more importantly, that's a problem for a historian to come in and make such big, bold predictions on an area that they're not actually specifically expert in.
Well, I rely on the experts, and what is interesting, what is vital for me is to try and understand from the experts what is or isn't possible to do with these kinds of technologies. How is not within my field of expertise. And if you try to cover everything, it's impossible. You have to give up something. I think most of the people who are very interested in the future of technology, they are experts in technology, so they understand these technical aspects of biotechnology, or genetic engineering, or artificial intelligence. But for me, the most interesting questions are not the technical ones, they are the political ones, the economic ones, the philosophical ones. And how can you make sense of what artificial intelligence would do to the economy or would do to religion if you don't have the necessary background in philosophy, in history? I think this is much more important. To take an analogy from a past technology, nuclear weapons, you don't really need to know how a nuclear bomb works. Maybe there is a demon inside. What do I care? I mean, what is important for me is that this device somehow, don't ask me how, this device I know can obliterate a city and kill hundreds of thousands of people in a minute. This is important to know. And this, building on that, you can start thinking about what this kind of weapon might mean for geopolitics or for religion. How does it work is not so important. But how did I get to this line?
I butted it, I'm so sorry. Well, is AI as dangerous in the wrong hands as a nuclear bomb?
It's dangerous in a different way. A nuclear bomb threatens the physical existence of humankind. Artificial intelligence, according to some experts like Nick Bostrom, also poses a physical threat. In some scenarios, a super intelligent AI might destroy on purpose humankind due to this or that reason. For instance, a favorite scenario is that the first, corporation that built the first super intelligent AI, in order to test the AI, gives the AI the task of calculating pi to see how it will do. And then the AI, the next thing it does, it destroys humankind, converts the entire planet into a huge computer that does nothing except calculating pi infinitely, because this is the sacred task that the creator gave me, to calculate pi. And these entities, they are using energy for all kinds of other purposes and not for calculating pi. So I must take away the energy to calculate pi, and they will resist it. So I had better strike first and destroy them. So this is one of Nick Bostrom's favorite scenarios, which is possible. Again, as a historian and a philosopher, I'm more inclined in thinking about the other ways in which artificial intelligence threatens humankind, which is not to obliterate us physically, but to make us redundant, irrelevant, useless, which from some perspective is an even worse fate. At least, there is some grandeur in this big apocalypse, but just being pushed aside and history continues without us, with the AI going on to do wonderful things and we are just a footnote, this, at least for some perspective, it's even a worse fate. And I think it's a more likely fate. I think in the next 50 years, it's unlikely that an AI will destroy the human race trying to calculate pi, but it is a very serious possibility that you will find hundreds of millions of people being pushed out of the job market and losing their economic and their political power because there is nothing that they can do better than an AI. We are already seeing this process happening in the military, whereas in the 20th century, the most advanced military forces in the world relied on recruiting millions and millions of soldiers, of ordinary people, to serve as soldiers in the army. And this made all these people vital for the state, So even totalitarian regimes like Nazi Germany invested in the health, in the education, in the welfare of millions of poor Germans, because Hitler knew and the Nazi elite knew that if we want Germany to be a strong nation with a strong army and a strong economy, we need all these millions to serve as soldiers in the army and as workers in the factories. We need them. And now in the early 21st century, in the military it's over. You don't need the millions of people to serve as soldiers in the army. The most advanced armies rely on relatively small numbers of very professional super warriors and more on advanced technology, such as drones and cyber wars and so forth. And the same process may begin to happen in the civilian economy as well.
Do you worry then that, because if you speak to people, which I have done, so Demeter Sabis, who is the chief executive of DeepMind, which is Google's AI business, is very clear that what artificial intelligence does, which is incredibly positive, is that it supports human endeavor. It doesn't make the decisions, it supports us in making the decisions. Whereas you're saying that the computers, or AI in some manner, gets ahead of where we are. How does that mechanism work where the computer starts deciding what is right and wrong and not leaving it to the human being to decide that? And hasn't that been a long science fiction? 2001: A Space Odyssey being the obvious one, and HAL deciding that the two astronauts weren't doing the right thing to save the mission and ejecting them for that reason. And it doesn't actually follow that computers will start making decisions on our behalf and then push us to one side.
Well, first of all, most people, their jobs don't require making these big ethical decisions. If you drive a taxi, or if you're a GP, a general practitioner doctor diagnosing a disease, you don't make these kinds of big decisions. And what you do, driving a car and picking passengers, bringing them from point A to point B, or diagnosing the disease that this patient is suffering from and recommending a treatment, this is basically based on pattern recognition. And this is something that is very likely an AI would be able to do better than most humans within 10, 20, 30 years.
Agreed, and even almost now with health data, for example, diagnostics, health data is very good, but it's always put in the hands of a physician, a doctor, to make the decision on what actually happens to the patient. The computer doesn't say, well, Yuval, I'm just going to give you this drug now, thanks very much, I think that's what you should do. And at the moment, human beings are still in control.
Yeah, at the moment, definitely. I mean, we are still not there. We still don't see this massive useless class. This is a possibility, development, which will take, again, these 10, 20, 30 years. But once you have an AI like IBM's Watson, which is able to diagnose diseases better than a human doctor and to recommend the right treatment, then some doctors you always need them. Like in the army, you have the special forces, you still need them, so you'll have the special forces equivalent in the medical profession, but the vast majority of GPs, like the vast majority of GIs, you don't need them. And again, it doesn't involve these big ethical questions. And even the ethical questions, it's really interesting if you think about AI replacing human drivers. So suddenly the AI will have to make ethical judgments, and a lot of philosophical thought experiments that philosophers have been arguing about for thousands of years will suddenly become technical problems that engineers at Google or Tesla have to solve. Like you have your autonomous car, and it's driving on the road, and suddenly it sees that it's about to run over somebody. But it can swerve to the side, fall off a cliff, kill you, and save these 5 people on the road. These are the kind of things that philosophy students in the first year at university have been arguing about for ages, and it never had any practical implications. Because even if you decide that the right thing to do is to swerve to the side and kill yourself and save the 5 people, it had no real impact on what people actually did in life, because research after research has shown that our theoretical views in real-life situations matter very little. We act in a very different way than what we say we should act in a philosophy class. With AI driving the car, suddenly you have the opportunity to implement philosophy, because the engineer at Google that designs the computer program, the algorithm, he or she, they need to answer this philosophical question. If the algorithm notices that there are 5 people, it's about to run over, and the only alternative is to swerve to the side, fall off a precipice, and kill the owner of the car, what to do? And you can have all kinds of solutions. You can have even several solutions, like Google or Tesla, they can go to the market with the altruistic car and the egoistic car. And
you can buy either.
Yeah, and the customer is always right. We'll just leave it to the customers to decide if they want a car that kills them or if they want a car that kills these 5 people. So suddenly, all these philosophical questions, I think that in the next few years, just as today Google is starting to hire not only computer hacks, but also biological experts, the next phase, there will be a lot of jobs for philosophers. And for people of that, because you'll start having these philosophical problems becoming practical problems in designing algorithms.
Do you worry, Yuval, that this type of debate is basically being had in a very limited fashion by books that you are writing, and in a very big fashion by the heads of companies in Silicon Valley, and that it's the heads of companies in Silicon Valley that are deciding these things, rather than what might be described as the human race?
Yes, I think this is a very, very big problem. If I think, say, about the last 20 years, what was the most important change in the world, in the lives of people over the last 20 years, in the economy, in politics, it's probably the internet and the information revolution. And when I think about it, the amazing thing is I never voted about the internet. In Israel, we have like an election campaign every year or so because the governments keep falling. So we go voting every year or two, and I never voted about the internet. It just happened without anybody asking me what I think about it. And this is true not only in Israel, but also here and also in the US. There is not just one kind of internet. The internet could have looked in very different ways. Decisions were made about critical things like sovereignty, like security, like privacy, what kind of internet we will have. And the decisions were not taken by the political system. They were not taken with almost any kind of democratic feedback or democratic discussion. I think so far the result is quite good, but I'm worried that the most important decisions in the world are taken by a very small number of people who represent basically nobody. And you look, for example, at the election campaign today in the US between Clinton and Trump, and nobody is talking about artificial intelligence, about biotechnology. And I think it's not because Trump has these views and he doesn't want anybody to know them, because there is no barrier between what he thinks and what he says. So he's not hiding any secret, dangerous views about artificial intelligence. He's simply not thinking about it. And also his voters don't care about it. And they go on making all these arguments and debates about immigration of Muslims and Mexicans and gay marriage and abortion and all that, not because these are the most important issues, but rather because these are the issues that people understand. So we prefer to talk about something we understand, even if it's not important, than try to talk about the really important stuff, which we don't understand. And it's very dangerous that basically the decisions that will shape the future, not only of humankind, but of life itself, these decisions are currently made, and the debate involves a very, very small number of people who don't really represent anybody.
Is the book then, Homo Deus, is it really a call to arms? And what is is there a solution to this problem in getting people to understand how serious an issue this is, and that we need to debate it, to think about it, and to have it as part of the kind of democratic discourse? How do we get ourselves there, given that people are mostly concerned about putting food on the table at the end of the week, And frankly, are their real incomes rising faster than inflation? I mean, how do we start this debate? And how, I mean, so for example, DeepMind has built an ethical committee which is going to give some views on these type of philosophical, I'll ring Demis actually and say you should be on the committee, but how do we get to that point where we actually are discussing this front and central in election campaigns across the world?
Well, first we need to realize that this is really happening, it's not science fiction, and it's happening quickly. It already has a huge impact on our life today. It will have a huge impact within the next few decades. Kids that start school today, it's the first day of school today, so like 6-year-old kids who just start the first grade today, nobody has any idea what to teach them because nobody knows what will be relevant to their lives in 30 years. What kind of jobs they will have in 2040, nobody has any idea. So we go on teaching them by inertia, the old stuff, not because anybody really thinks it's relevant, but don't have any better idea. So these issues are not, something for future generations to worry about. We should worry about them today. And so the first thing is to understand the time framework, that it's a question of decades and not centuries or millennia. Secondly, we should understand that it has a huge impact on issues like real incomes and putting food on the table, and that it involves day-to-day decisions that people make, not just some huge government or corporate decisions. It's how much authority you give to your smartphone to manage your life for you. It's how much information you give for free. I mean, the amazing thing, like with information today, is probably for more and more people, the most important asset they still have is their personal information. This is the most important thing they have from the perspective of the system, of the state, of the big corporations. It's your personal data. And we are giving it for free in exchange for email services and funny cat videos. And it's a bit like, you have all these stories about European imperialists in the 16th and 17th century, like coming to Africa or to America and buying the whole of Manhattan for a few colorful beads. And it's happening again. I mean, you have this Google and Facebook coming with these few colorful beads of the funny cat videos. And hey, take these funny cat videos and just give me information in exchange. And we are doing it. And nobody's forcing us to do it. It's not a government decision. It's still, to some extent, in our hands. And it's something that we can do something about in our daily life. We don't even have to wait for an election campaign to debate and to do something about these issues.
Because that's the issue, isn't it? The internet is democratic because we all use it or don't use it. No one's forcing us to do these things, but we decide to do them.
There are more and more jobs that try to tell your boss that you don't want to have an email account or mobile phone and see what the reaction will be.
But this because they are such helpful devices. I mean, are they not positive things that have given us a huge amount of increased convenience? Mm-hmm. It means we don't waste time leafing through the A to Z to find this venue tonight. It's on our smartphone where we're going and we can walk and follow that. Mm-hmm. And in exchange for that, we give them some of my data about what kind of restaurants I like to go to so they can do some advertising. Mm-hmm. Sort of, so what?
Well, some of it is definitely helpful. I mean, almost all technological revolutions in history were helpful, but almost all of them also had a negative side. And technology by itself is not deterministic. It never tells you or forces you what to do with it. You can do with it different things. If you look again at the Industrial Revolution, so you have these new technologies of the steam engine and the train and the telegraph and the radio. And with exactly the same technology, you could construct a communist dictatorship, you could construct a fascist regime, and you could construct a liberal democracy. The trains didn't tell you whether they prefer to be used to build a fascist or a communist or a liberal state. And it's the same thing with the new technologies. They are not bad or good, but they are not neutral either. We can't just ignore them. You can use it to do a lot of good, but there are also very big dangers inherent in them. And I'm not saying stop the technological progress, this is impossible anyway, but we should be aware of what is happening and be more careful about the decisions that we are taking now.
Who becomes the group of useless Homo sapiens, and who becomes the group that become Homo Deus? And are we already seeing a whiff, if not more than that, of this gradual divide between the billionaires in Silicon Valley, you and me, and someone on $1 a week in Bangladesh?
Yes, definitely. We are seeing inequality on the rise. And
this is sort of astonishing inequality, though. It's a different type of inequality.
Yeah, what we're talking about is, for the first time in history, social and economic inequality may be translated into basic biological inequality. I mean, there was always also some kind of biological inequality in the sense that the rich had better food and they were taller because of that and so forth. But still, there was no real difference between the nobility and the peasantry, between the upper castes and the lower castes, in terms of the basic physical and cognitive and mental abilities. In the 21st century, for the first time in history, we might start seeing social and economic inequality being translated into biological inequality, with Homo sapiens dividing into different biological castes and eventually maybe even into different species. In the same way that, for 2 million years, there were many different species of humans living on the planet side by side. It's only in the last 20,000 years or so that all the other human species went extinct because of us, and you had only Homo sapiens. All humans on the planet are a single species Homo sapiens. These 20,000 years may turn out to be a very short interlude, and Homo sapiens will again diverge and will have a multiplicity of human or human-like species in the coming centuries.
And it's a function of wealth who gains, because you talk in the book about the inorganic and the organic joining together in some ways. Which I'm going to come to questions relatively soon, so please do start formulating those. But when you talk about the organic and the inorganic, it's a function of wealth who can gain most from that. So if you're Elon Musk, boy, you've got an advantage, and you could be the first sense of the new super race.
Yes.
If you're on $1 a day in Bangladesh,
you're
miss out.
Yes, I think that, again, we are in an analogous position to the 19th century Industrial Revolution. Like we are again in 1810 or 1830, and the Industrial Revolution is starting to become big. And then you have small numbers of societies, of nations, which are industrializing, they are understanding what is happening, and these small number of relatively small nations, like Britain, they become the dominant power in the world. And other societies, huge countries like China, like India, like most of the Islamic world, they are being left behind. And it took China about 150 horrendous years of exploitation and war and so forth to close the gap that opened in the early 19th century with industrialization. Other parts of the world, like much of Africa, hasn't managed to close the gap even today. And I sense that something like that is starting to happen again. And this time, those left behind will never have a chance to close the gap.
Won't there be this trickle-down effect, as some economists would say, that the fact that Britain, the United States, obviously continental Europe, led this charge through the Industrial Revolution, and actually spread the ability to solve famine, to prevent disease, to, in the end, prevent at least the worst exaggerations of war, and that actually that's a good thing, and that whatever the risks of artificial intelligence and the notion of the organic and the inorganic coming together, in the end, the person in Bangladesh will be advantaged by the work in Silicon Valley.
Well, first of all, in the case of the Industrial Revolution, it took 100 or 150 years, which involved horrendous atrocities and suffering in much of the world, until the people in Bangladesh started seeing real benefits out of the Industrial Revolution. And there are two problems with thinking that this will simply repeat itself. First of all, the gap will be much bigger. The gap between a society that knows how to produce bodies and brains and a society that doesn't know how to produce bodies and brains is much, much bigger than the gap between those who know how to produce a steamship and those who don't. And it will become impossible to close the gap because the one doing the closing, the human being, is itself the thing that you're improving. So the longer you stay behind, the bigger the gap becomes, not smaller. Secondly, to a large extent, what enabled countries like China, like Korea, like Bangladesh to close the gap, at least to some extent, is cheap labor. This is the main thing that they had to offer. Why to move a textile factory from Manchester to India to China? Cheap labor. In the 21st century, again, it's not a prophecy, I'm not sure about it, but it is a likely scenario that we have to take very seriously, is that cheap labor will count for nothing. It will be simply irrelevant. When you have nanotechnology and 3D printers and artificial intelligence and all that, maybe you will still need something from some humans, but cheap labor working in a factory will not be it. So what could the next generation of left behinds, what could they offer the advanced economy of the second part of the 21st century? It's unclear.
Just finally, before I come to the audience, on algorithms and the role of algorithms and how we view their power, and this sort of change from a humanistic approach to the world to an algorithmic approach to the world. Can you just explain maybe some of the advantages, as you say, in technology there are often advantages, but also some of the risks about this view of the world that has really changed, probably, as for your argument, our view of kind of liberal democracy?
Mm-hmm. Well, for the last century or two, the dominant ideology or religion of much of the world has been humanism, which says that human feelings are the highest authority in the world, in all fields. In politics, how do we know who should rule the country or whether the UK should leave the EU? We don't ask God, we don't read it in the Bible, we don't ask the Pope, we don't ask even the Council of Nobel laureates. We come to each and every person and ask, how do you feel about the UK leaving the EU? And this is how the important political decisions are made. Similarly, in the economy, at least in theory, the highest authority is the customer and the feelings and wishes and desires of the customer. The customer is always right. If the customer wants something, there is no higher authority which can tell him or her that they are wrong. And it's the same in ethics, it's the same in art, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and in humanist ethic, the idea is if it feels good, do it. All major debates in humanist ethics is when feelings clash. If I feel that something is good and you feel that something is bad, what do we do then? Then we have an ethical debate. But if I feel that something is good and God says otherwise, nobody cares in a humanist society. It's only feelings that really count. And what science now tells us is that all this story about free will and human feelings and individuals making decisions, this is just fairy tales. This is just the modern mythology. There is no free will, according to at least the biological sciences today. And human feelings are not this transcendental, magical thing emanating from some divine spark within ourselves. Human feelings are just biochemical algorithms that were shaped by millions and millions of years of evolution. It is true, the biologists will agree, it is true that until today, human feelings were probably the best decision-making system that we know about. if you had to choose between your feelings and the Bible, you should definitely go with your feelings. The Bible represents the biases of a few priests in ancient Jerusalem. What do they know? Your feelings represent the accumulated wisdom of millions of years of evolution that have passed the most rigorous quality control tests of natural selection. Your feelings are there because millions of ancestors survived and reproduced relying on these feelings. So it made good sense. Humanism was correct in telling you, listen to yourself, listen to your heart, don't listen to the priests, don't listen to the Pope. But this was because nobody in the world understood what's happening within you, within your body. And nobody had the computing power necessary to decipher the inner workings of the human body and brain and these algorithms, the feelings. So even if, I don't know, the Soviet KGB followed you around every day and recorded every phone call you make and every conversation, they did not have the understanding of biology, and they did not have the necessary computing power to really understand you and why you feel the way you feel. But this is now changing. These two conditions are now met. We are gaining the biological understanding of what's happening within the body, within the brain, which produces all these feelings and desires and wishes. And we are gaining also the computing power necessary to accumulate these massive amounts of data on me and on you, and to analyze them and to understand me much better than I understand myself. We are very close to the point when Google and Facebook and Amazon will understand how I feel better than I understand how I feel. And just to give a practical example so it doesn't sound too far-fetched. So we are here talking about books. So up till now in history, humans read books. This was the deal. Now we are approaching or in the process of a new stage in which books read humans. When I read a book on Kindle, on Amazon's Kindle, so I read the book, of course, but at the same time, Kindle is reading me. Kindle knows how fast I read or how slow I read each page. It knows when I stopped reading, when I start reading again. It knows if I stopped on a particular page and never return to the book. And this gives Amazon certain data about who I am and what my preferences are. But this is still very, very primitive. The next stage is that when you connect Kindle with face recognition programs, which are already in existence, and then the Kindle device can start knowing what is the emotional impact of every sentence you read on you by analyzing your facial expression. But this is still primitive, because it's still just external signals. The next stage, which is just around the corner, is to connect the Kindle to biometric sensors inside your body. And when we reach that stage, Kindle, which means Amazon, will know exactly what is the emotional impact of every sentence you read. What made you angry, what made you bored, what made you happy. And whereas I and you and most people, we forget most of what we read within a few days or a few weeks, Amazon will never forget anything. By the time you finish reading the book, you may know something new or not, I don't know, but Amazon will know exactly who you are, what is your personality type, and how to press your emotional buttons. And when you reach this stage, then institutions like democratic elections and free markets will be as obsolete as flint knives and rain dances.
So, you can now prove Professor Harari wrong by showing how non-useless you are, otherwise you'll all be replaced by computers. So let's have some questions. There's a lady right down here. We'll do this side for a bit first. Anyone else there? And the gentleman just behind with the blue shirt and the white hair there. Yes, madam.
Well, when you when you say computers will be able to know us better than we know ourselves, I've just been reviewing your book, which is brilliant, but there is one fatal inconsistency, I think, and that is when you say that, what sort of knowing do you mean? It's only a metaphorical knowing.
Yeah.
You've said yourself in that book, you've been so much cleverer than Dennett, in the way that who's a ghastly philosopher, but in the way that you've said we can discard the soul, we can't discard the mind. The mind isn't like a collection of things like a traffic jam is a collection of cars. There's something over and above, like in Gödel's theorem, there's something over and above the neural bits and pieces. And you've also said the whole point of testing laboratory rats for antidepressants is not to see what they do, but it's surmising how they feel and then extrapolating from that to how human beings feel. So in which case that is discordant with the fact that you're talking about computers knowing, Amazon knowing. It's not knowing. You know yourself that it's not knowing.
It's a different type of knowledge.
Yes, it's a very, very important point, and I'm very glad that you made it, that you mentioned it. What we are actually talking about here is the decoupling of intelligence from consciousness. Many people, especially in the business of creating artificial intelligence, they tend to confuse intelligence and consciousness, which is understandable because in human beings, the two go together. But there are very different things. Intelligence basically is the ability to solve things, to solve problems, whereas consciousness is having subjective experiences, feeling something. Now, over the last 60, 70, 80 years, there have been an immense progress in computer intelligence. There has been exactly zero development in computer consciousness. In the 1940s, the first computers had zero consciousness, and today they have zero consciousness, and we don't see any signs of any computer gaining any kind of consciousness anytime soon. So in this sense, yes, knowing in the true sense of a subjective experience, this is far beyond Kindle and Amazon and all the AI. The big problem is that as long as consciousness and intelligence went together, which was the case in humans for millions of years, debating the relationship between them and the relative importance was an exercise for philosophers, but had very little practical implications. Now, when we see the decoupling of intelligence from consciousness, there is a big practical question of which is more important to whom? To the economic system, to the political system, to the military, to the army. And the disconcerting fact is that for the system, for the economic system, for the military system, only intelligence matters. They cared about consciousness only because they needed it as a kind of substratum for intelligence. But if they can have intelligence without consciousness, they don't really care about it. If you think about most professions, what you need from a taxi driver is to bring you from point A to point B as cheaply and efficiently as possible. Until today, taxi drivers had to have consciousness because the only entities that could do it were human beings. But once you have a self-driving car that can do it, so the system won't care that the self-driving car has no consciousness, that it doesn't feel anything, because it doesn't need the taxi driver to feel anything. It's a bit like what happened to horses in the Industrial Revolution, that why were horses replaced by cars? There are a million things that a horse can do and that no car can do. Horses can feel joy, horses can feel sadness, horses can feel pain, horses can feel love. No car can do that. But we don't need these things from cars. The 3 or 4 things we do need from vehicles, cars do better than horses, and this is why they were replaced. So I think one of the big dangers that we are facing in the 21st century is that when intelligence decouples from consciousness, the tendency of the system, of corporations, of governments, of armies, is to discard consciousness and just invest in intelligence.
Thank you. Sir?
What does history tell us about our ability to predict?
That it's very limited, and it's becoming how do you say, smaller all the time. It's becoming more difficult. Today, maybe for the first time in history, we haven't got a clue about the most basic features of human society in 20 or 30 years. In the Middle Ages, or in the 18th century, or even the 19th century, of course, there are many things you didn't know about what the world would be like in, say, 50 years. Maybe there will be some invasion, maybe the dynasties will be replaced, but the basics of human life were going to stay the same. Most people will be peasants, the human body will be the same, the human mind will be the same, and so forth. Today, for the first time in history, we don't really know the basics of how human life would look like in 40 or 50 years. What kind of jobs people will have, if any? What kind of bodies? What kind of sexual and romantic relations they will have in 50 years? Nobody really knows. So in this sense, our ability to predict the future, paradoxically, because we have more data and more data processing, more computing power than ever before, precisely because of that, our ability to predict the future is declining, because the more data and more computing power we have, the faster the changes are in the world. So again, paradoxically, more data, more computing power means a lesser ability to predict the future. And maybe to give one concrete example from politics over the last decade or two, if you think about the United States, the American empire, so the US today have more and better information about the world than any empire, any superpower could even dream about a century or 1,000 years ago. And nevertheless, if you look at what the United States have done in the Middle East over the last 10 or 15 years, there are few empires in history that made such lousy decisions as the US has made. It's like somebody who is playing poker, and he knows exactly the cards that the other players are holding, and he still manages to lose one round after the other. So they have all this data about everything that is happening, but they don't have the ability, probably, to make sense of it and to translate it into sensible predictions and policies.
Isn't that quite heartening? This is quite heartening. They've got all this data and they're bloody useless at using it, so they need us lot to have a little think about it. Isn't that quite a good thing? They're clearly so bad at using data.
Yeah, but the tendency is to say...
We've got a chance, the old useless lot.
Yes, but the tendency is to say, okay, the solution will... Humans are simply incapable of handling these massive amounts of data, so
right.
we have no choice but to transfer authority to the only things that are able to handle these massive amounts of data, which are beyond the capacity of the human brain. These are the external algorithms, the big data systems. So you're already now seeing more and more authority being transferred from humans to algorithms because humans are incapable of handling these massive amounts of data.
Gentleman there. Who else is up in that? There's a lady there, yes, next there at the back with the glasses. Yep. Yes, sir.
Just two things very quickly. Firstly, at the time of the Industrial Revolution, obviously forecasts of huge unemployment in the future were abundant, which hasn't materialized. The Homo Silicon Valley has unemployment, or the US has unemployment of circa, let's call it 4%. So that never happened. And what do you think makes it different this time round? Mm-hmm. And secondly, very quickly, do you think this has any bearing on happiness?
So about the first question, which is a very good question, the basic difference between the 19th century Industrial Revolution and what's happening now is that we are now reaching the limits of what we know are human abilities in a way which was not true in the 19th century or in the 20th century. Homo sapiens, as far as science is concerned, has basically two kinds of abilities, physical bodily abilities and cognitive abilities. In the Industrial Revolution, machines replaced humans more and more in jobs that required mainly physical abilities, and then humans moved to working in new jobs that required mainly cognitive abilities. Now what is happening is that computers and artificial intelligence are starting to compete with us in these cognitive abilities, and we don't know about any third kind of field of ability that we can, okay, let's leave the cognitive things to the computers and we'll do something else. There is no something else. I mean, one suggestion is emotional abilities, emotional intelligence. But the problem is that at least from a biological perspective, emotions are not special. They are not unique. They are not different from other cognitive abilities. Emotions are not some, I don't know, spiritual transcendent thing that God gave only Homo sapiens in order to write poetry and things like that. No. Emotions, as we said earlier, at least according to mainstream biology, are biochemical algorithms shaped by natural selection. And already today, computers are starting to outperform humans even when it comes to emotional intelligence. They don't have emotional consciousness. They don't have emotions of their own. But their ability, for example, to diagnose correctly your emotional state is becoming better than the ability of human beings. Human beings, if I want to assess what your emotion, what you feel now in terms of emotions.
A bit stupid mostly, but yeah.
I rely mainly on external signals, visual, audio, and to some extent also smell. I see your facial expression, I hear the tone of your voice, I analyze it, I recognize patterns, and I say, okay, he's fearful, he's angry, he's bored, whatever. Now, this is something that computers are now learning to do, to analyze and recognize patterns in facial expressions, in tones of voice. They are learning to do it even better than human beings. But more importantly, they are gaining access into a completely new and superior type of data, which is data coming from inside your body. When I look at you, I don't know what's happening in your brain. I don't know what is the current heartbeat, current heart rate, or your blood pressure. But an AI will be able to know exactly which part of your brain are now working, and what is your heartbeat, and what is your blood pressure by these biometric sensors. And relying on that, even when it comes to emotional intelligence, AI is likely to be far superior to humans. So even this is blocked. We don't know at present about a third kind of ability that humans can have, which is superior to computers. Now, of course, there will be many new jobs. We just don't know whether humans will be able to do the new jobs better than computers. Another problem, another difference compared with the Industrial Revolution era is that the pace of change is accelerating. So even if there are new jobs that humans are able to do better than computers, we will have to reinvent ourselves again and again to change our profession every 10 or 20 years. And this is something that is going to be extremely difficult for most people. Let's say there are new jobs in designing virtual worlds. And let's say you are a 50-year-old insurance agent or taxi driver, and you're left without a job because an AI has taken it over. But there is an opening in designing virtual worlds. What kind of virtual world a 50-year-old insurance agent is going to design? Will he or she be able to reinvent themselves at 50 as a designer of virtual worlds? These are the kinds of problems that, again, it's not a certainty, it's not a prophecy, but it should give us pause, and it should make us think harder and not just be complacent and say, okay, we've seen it before in the Industrial Revolution, we can just relax and something will come up. Some new jobs will open for all these jobless taxi drivers and doctors and whatever.
And what about happiness? What does it mean for happiness? This means that we can just sit back, read poetry. Yes, the book might understand me, but I'm just going to have a great life because I won't have to work anymore. The computers will do all the mundane tasks, and we can sit around philosophizing.
That's one possibility. It could happen. I mean, one big problem is that you will lose all political power, which is always very dangerous. I mean, if the new masters will be very kind, so yes, you could have a very enjoyable life, but it's a very dangerous position.
Why will we lose all political power?
When you lose your economic importance, you usually lose your political power. I don't know if you think about taxi drivers, so each of them commands a small share of the transportation market, and this also gives them political power. For instance, they can unionize, and if something happens they don't like, they go on strike. But if they're all replaced by a single algorithmic network of vehicles, all self-driving, all connected to a single master algorithm, then all this political power that previously belonged to 10,000 taxi drivers is now owned by a single corporation which controls the algorithm which drives all the vehicles in the city. And this is a dangerous position to be in. Secondly, people need meaning in order to be happy, not just food and comfort. And a very big question is what will provide humans with meaning in such a situation. One possible answer that some experts say, the answer will be drugs and computer games. People will control their mood with drugs and will spend more and more time in more and more sophisticated virtual worlds, which will provide them with far more excitement, far more emotional involvement, far more meaning than the gray, drab reality outside in which they are completely useless. The third issue, the third problem, is that if we learned anything about humans over the last tens of thousands of years, is that it's extremely difficult to satisfy them. No matter what happens, even good things, the basic tendency of the human mind is to react to achievement and even to pleasure, not with satisfaction, but with craving for more. So no matter what humans achieve, they tend just to even accelerate the pursuit of more, and it's unlikely to change anytime soon, this basic tendency.
Fabulous. There's a woman there at the back, and there's a gentleman just in front with a beard. Yeah.
Hi. So I was a little bit disheartened by one of the comments you made on the fact that Africa, Asia, they spend a long time to catch up on the gap created by the Industrial Revolution. So, and before today, I thought actually the future would depend on demographics because here population is declining, but in Africa and Asia they're rising, and whatever we create here with our intelligence, there will be the market. So the economy growth will still depend on these countries, but maybe I'm wrong because, like you said, the cheap labor and all these theories become irrelevant. So I'm curious at the country level, what do you think will happen to the country inequality we see in the world? How can these developing countries possibly catch up? And also, another question is, so you mentioned that it's hard to teach kids and we depend on inertia, which is a very good word to use. So what can we and how can we teach the children so that they have a possible future?
Just aware of lots of questions, Yuval, so maybe we'll just speed up the answers slightly.
Okay, so regarding the countries, I think it's the biggest question facing every country today is whether it's part of the revolution or whether it's missing the train. And I don't think it's predetermined which countries will miss the train. The same as with the Industrial Revolution, it was not predetermined that Japan will catch the train, but that China will be left behind for a long time. So it's also true of countries today. Regarding the second question,
is on what do we teach the children?
Oh,
you said that teaching children at 6 is a bit irrelevant at the moment.
The most important, you don't need to teach them any data. They are flooded with data. They don't know what to do with it. The most important thing to teach them is how to face uncertainty and how to constantly reinvent themselves, not only when they are 10-year-old or 15-year-old, but how to keep doing it throughout their lives, because I think that at least social survival in the 21st century will require a constant process of learning and changing and reinventing, whereas the previous model throughout most of history was of a life divided into 2 phases, very roughly. Initial phase in which you mainly learn, and then a second phase in which you mainly do. This is no longer not going to work anymore. The change is so fast that by the time you start doing, what you learn is irrelevant. So the borderline between the learning phase and the doing phase will have to be completely blurred. And this is extremely difficult for people. It's not easy to invent yourself when you're 15, but it's almost impossible when you're 50. So I think we should invest in the kind of emotional intelligence, in the kind of mental skills that will give this kind of suppleness, of fluidity, for people to be able to keep changing, to keep reinventing themselves, even when they're in their 40s and 50s and 60s.
Great. This gentleman there, and then we'll come down to the front here. Yeah.
Yes, so two questions. The first one
We
is...
just have one. Sorry,
Okay,
lots of
just
people
one.
want questions.
So if robots and AI, they're clearly lowering the cost of production. Someone needs to capture that profit, right, that has come because of lower costs of production. And up until the 1980s, companies that generated those profits would employ and invest, and you'd get this self-perpetuating economic growth. Since the 1980s, it's shown up in lower prices. So inflation has been a lot lower. People are sitting, instead of serving in a cinema, for instance, they're now on the internet, surfing and gaining enjoyment that way. So you're seeing it in lower prices. So the question is, why can't that continue? And how do you see this dynamic between profits and owners of capital and labor and laborers playing out in the next few years?
Well, again, it's only a possibility. I mean, there are different possibilities, but I think the most worrying possibility is that labor becoming less and less important, less and less necessary, human labor, and then more and more of the profits being accumulated by a very small elite that controls the master algorithms, the artificial intelligence, and so forth. So it's not the only scenario. As I said earlier, technology is not deterministic. Just as with the steam engine and the internal combustion engine, you could create a communist dictatorship or a liberal democracy. So also with algorithms and artificial intelligence and biotechnologies, there are different scenarios. I focus on the more worrying scenarios in the hope that we'll do something in order to prevent them from being realized.
So, yeah.
So I guess my question follows from that in a sense. It's a Marxist question. You seem, the technology that you're describing is in the hands of the major corporations now. The progress is being made. Do you think that was historically inevitable when you look back? And do you not think that ideology is required in order for us to organize to oppose, thinking of Uber as an example?
Yes, definitely. I mean, it's not inevitable, and ideology is extremely important. One of the worrying things about the world today is that the dominant ideology, certainly in the West, is neoliberalism, which basically tells governments, you don't need to know anything, you don't need to do anything. Just leave it to market forces and everything will be okay. And this worked to some extent, at least in some areas, but in the 21st century, this can be a catastrophic ideology, because I wouldn't trust market forces to come up with the best solutions for problems like global warming or like the dangers inherent in the rise of artificial intelligence. And the thing is that governments really like to believe in the neoliberal dogma because it basically exonerates them from any responsibility. And it tells them the fact that you're ignorant and that you're not entering these debates and you're not doing anything, this is something good. It's not something that means that you're ignorant or incapable or whatever. It means that you're very wise. It's very wise to be ignorant about what is happening and to do nothing, because you're then leaving it to the really smart forces, which is not you, it's the market forces. And the next incarnation of this kind of thinking would be just leave it to the algorithms. We are incapable of processing the data, so just leave the big decisions to the algorithms. And there is a direct line, I think, leading from this kind of neoliberal thinking to this dataist thinking that says algorithms analyzing big data will come up with the solution. And actually, there is a very strong view that until today, the stock market has basically functioned as the most sophisticated data processing system in the world. And it was wise to give this external, unconscious data processing system the power, the authority to make the most important decisions in the world. And if we allow this authority to the market, to the stock exchange, then why not do the same thing with the next stage of evolution of these external data processing systems?
Thanks. Lady here, yeah, and then the lady there next to her.
How will the balance play out in terms of the consumers? If we have artificial intelligence working and we have a useless class that doesn't earn, who will consume? Who will purchase? Where does the purchasing power lie? And how does that economic balance work? Because it'll be very different to the one that we have today.
Yes, we don't have at present any economic model to deal with such a situation. Some people say the state should just tax the big earners and then give free money, like a basic salary to everybody without their having to work. There are all kinds of models people are trying to develop. We don't have any precedent for such a thing happening. One other possibility is that the algorithms will buy from one another. One algorithm will buy the product of another. You don't really need to have people in between in order to have commerce. It's already beginning to happen. If you think about, for example, advertisement, then who is the #1 consumer or client of the advertisement industry today, at least on the internet? It's no human being, it's the Google algorithm. If you want to advertise your business and to succeed, then the consumer you need to think about is the Google algorithm. How to make my business attractive, not to you or to me, but to the Google algorithm. And the minute that an algorithm becomes the main target of advertising, we don't call it advertisement, of course. There is no, I don't know, naked algorithms like to draw the Google algorithm attention, hey, look at me. But there is the equivalent of the naked algorithm to draw the attention of the Google algorithm, so put my site first. And once it happens the same thing may happen in more and more industries.
Lady there.
So actually, the whole theory you have, even in Sapiens and also in Homo Deus, it really takes me to Susan Blackmore's thinking of memes rather than genes actually driving us. And my question is more on, who is actually in the driving seat? Is it really the billionaires? Because they themselves also make mistakes. They themselves also follow, concepts and what you call fictions. So who's actually in the driving seat, and how can we actually perhaps use, is technology the first entity that is going to be in the driving seat because they're making objective decisions?
We don't really know any longer who is in the driving seat. It doesn't seem that there are any group of humans who are now in the driving seat. Nobody really understands what's happening in the world anymore. I mean, no government and no secret cabal or something, nobody really understands what is now happening in the world and where the world will be in 10 or 20 years. And neoliberalism as an ideology is very attractive precisely because of that. Because I think the people in power, they know, they don't understand, they don't run the business. So it's very comforting when they have this neoliberalism whispering in their ear. It's very good that you're not in control and you're not understanding what's happening. Just leave it to the market. And I don't think that there is anybody else like the billionaires sitting in some secret cave and running the world. I mean, it's too complicated. If you have very narrow aims, like you as this multi-billionaire, and you want to game the system to make another $10 billion, this is easy. Because in a chaotic world, when you have tunnel vision, when you have a very narrow aim, making another $1 billion, this is relatively easy. But if you have a wider aim, like I want to stop global warming, I want to stop the rise in inequality, nobody has any idea how to do it.
Lady at the back, final question.
Okay, so slightly changing the tack a little bit. Even if you think that an AI could gain the emotional intelligence to maybe diagnose someone with depression by looking at the chemicals in their brain to see whether they are depressed or not, do you ever think that they could gain the emotional consciousness, as you said, kind of showing the difference, to consistently be a therapist to someone with depression or someone with schizophrenia if they haven't had the emotional consciousness of living a life as someone like a therapist has had?
I don't think that they will gain emotional consciousness or any kind of consciousness anytime soon. I haven't seen any evidence that we are coming near enough to understanding what consciousness is, so that we can give it to computers. But I do think that emotional intelligence can go a very, very long way, even when it's not accompanied by consciousness. In the case of humans, when we try to sympathize with the emotional state of another person, when we try to treat somebody with mental illness, we often try to rely on our own emotional state. Oh, when I feel this, it would be helpful if I would be in that kind of situation. So maybe I can do this for that person. Now, an AI therapist would not function in such a way. It would use the strong ability of AI to recognize patterns. It will analyze, it will understand the emotional state of this person by recognizing biological patterns in his or her body. And then when it comes to treatment, it will try to recognize patterns in millions of other patients throughout the world who suffered from a similar condition, what worked and what did not work. And based on this pattern recognition, it will try to help this person. Whether it will succeed or not is in the end an empirical question. There is no point in arguing in advance whether it will be successful or not. It's an empirical question. We'll have to wait and see, and we probably won't have to wait very long. Now, the huge advantage of an AI therapist is that it's everywhere, all the time, and very, very cheap. In the case of human therapists, in order to train a therapist, you need like 10 years. And after that, also many years of experience before he or she becomes a very good therapist. And then they charge a lot of money for like 45 minutes or 50-minute session. And they are not available all the time everywhere. If I go to India and I have a crisis there, I mean, my therapist is back home, so what to do? But if my therapist is an AI application on my mobile phone, it's all the time with me. I don't even have to notice myself that I'm having a nervous breakdown or something. It will alert me when it's just starting. Hey, look out. And again, in the end, it's an empirical question. If it will help people, then people will choose to rely on it more and more. And it's the same with all the other of these wondrous algorithms gaining authority. Like you have now these ubiquitous algorithms on a mobile phone that tell you like how to get to this place. You exit the tube on embankment, and how do you get to this Emmanuel Center? So if previously you tried to rely on your memory and your gut feeling or whatever, so now you take up the application and you ask Google, how do I get to the Emmanuel Center? And then it's an empirical question. If it gets you to the wrong place, you won't rely on it anymore. For authority to shift away from humans to these algorithms, the algorithms will not have to be perfect. They will just have to be better on average than human beings. And this is not so difficult because human beings make such terrible mistakes in the most important decisions of their lives that it's not inconceivable that, at least in most cases, algorithms will be able to outperform us, and then authority will shift away in decisions like what to study, where to work, where to live, whom to marry. Authority to make these decisions will shift from humans to algorithms.
Phew. So sadly, this debate could go on for another sort of 6 months, quite happily, to be frank, Yuval. Absolutely amazing. Of course, Google won't send us here if it knows we're listening to you. It'll send us somewhere else to make sure we can't hear all your clever arguments, just to set us off on our way before we draw to a close, so we're not all too sad about your prognosis for the future. Please prove to us that you are not simply the world's cleverest pessimist. In a couple of sentences.
Well, first of all, I think that to a large extent it depends on age. I think people under 20
Sod it.
will hear this talk and they will say, wow, exciting, and not, oh, so what pessimist. Because, again, until a certain age, we like change, and we are in the business of reinventing ourselves. And beyond a certain age, we're basically in the business of keeping things as they are, and we don't like huge changes. Secondly, I think that in the past, humankind has proven its ability to rise up to the challenge, at least some of the challenges, posed by new technologies. The most promising example, I think, certainly in recent generations, is the human reaction to nuclear power and to nuclear weapons. In the 1950s and 1960s, it was very widespread to think that the world would end, or humanity will end quite soon in some kind of nuclear holocaust. It's a kind of, the Chekhov law in theater, that a gun appearing on the first act must fire on the third act. And the gun appeared in 1945, the first act of the Cold War. And a lot of people, very clever people, were convinced that the play will not end unless the gun fires. And the gun did not fire. Instead of a nuclear holocaust, we actually experienced in the last few decades the most peaceful era in human history. Still conflicts there are in some places. I come from Israel, so I know there are still conflicts in the world. But it's the most peaceful era in history, largely thanks to nuclear weapons, which forced humankind and the political class and the superpower to completely change the rules of the game of geopolitics. The way humans behaved for thousands of years, they stopped behaving like that in the last few decades because they had to confront this new menace of nuclear weapons. Now, of course, nothing is guaranteed about the future. Maybe there still will be a nuclear holocaust in the next few years or next few decades, but compared to the 1950s, we are now far more optimistic about nuclear weapons and our ability to handle them. So I think this gives us a real, concrete, and very important precedent for the ability of humankind to rise up to the challenge of revolutionary new technologies and avoid the dangers and actually make something good out of it.
On that optimistic note, I'm going to draw it to a close. Thank you so much, Yuval, for an amazing 90 minutes.